All right, guys, welcome back to history class. I am going to try to get through this without being interrupted too many times by Emmy, but she is in the other room, so bear with me. Before we get started, you might want some paper or something to jot down some notes and ideas and thoughts that you might have, because it will probably be beneficial with your assignment. We have been talking about Western expansion, and we're going to talk about the War of 1812 in like the briefest possible terms, because this war lasted a few years, and we are going to basically cover it in one like 15 to 20-minute video. So very, very basic outline of the War of 1812. Now, before we get talking to the actual war and things that led to the war, we first need to briefly touch on the fact that as the United States is expanding and people are moving west, they are continuing, when I say they, I mean the Americans are continuing to encroach or move into the land that the Indians are living on. And this has been a problem we've talked about before. It is basically the ever ongoing problem between the Americans and the Indians. The fact that the Americans just come right on over and take over the Indians' land. Now, there was this one Indian guy by the name of Tecumseh who basically decided that he had had it with the Americans settling on their land. And so he, in an effort to stop this from happening, he joined forces with Britain, the English, to try to prevent this from happening. So the British offered to help, obviously, because they have a beef with the United States and the fact that they lost the Revolutionary War. The Indians obviously don't like the Americans. So the two out on the Western Front are joining forces to try to prevent this from happening. And it's not entirely successful, but it does lead to some of the tension between the Americans and the British again. Because after the Revolutionary War, both sides kind of parted, right? America had to establish themselves as a country. England, the British soldiers went back to England to figure out what to do next and to recover from this defeat, and to go on continuing trying to conquer, places in Europe. So there hasn't been a whole lot of like interaction really between the two countries since the end of the Revolutionary War, which was really not that long ago, less than right around 50 years maybe. So that kind of sets the stage for some tensions between the British and the Americans, which leads us to the next part of the issues that are going on. So the War of 1812 is between the Americans and the British. This is the United States' second war with Britain. Obviously the first being the Revolutionary War. So as people are moving west, and the British have band together with the Indians to try to stop this, tensions are already rising, and they continue to rise because the Americans are starting to grow very angry with the British in the sense of trade. So here's the thing. At this point in history, the British and France are at war with one another. Now, the United States has good trade relations with France. The United States relies on trading with France to get a lot of their goods and supplies. And the British know that. So what the British do is they work to intercept and stop the American trade ships that are trying to trade with France. And they capture their soldiers and they capture their ships. And they basically force their soldiers that are captured to go and stay in England and fight for the British Army against France. So this leads to very high tensions. President Madison basically says he's had it, and the British can't keep doing this and keep getting away with it. So he asks Congress to declare war on Britain, and Congress agrees. Remember, the president can't just declare war. It has to be voted on. Okay, so Congress agrees. England is not listening to them. They can't seem to resolve this peacefully. So here America finds itself in another full-on war with England. And this is still a big deal because while the United States is definitely in a better position than they were against the British in the Revolutionary War, the British Army is still far, far superior to the Americans. The British still have far more soldiers. They are still overall better trained. And the biggest kicker is the British have a way bigger Navy than the Americans. So while it's a little bit more even of a fight, it's still going to be a lot of work for the Americans to be able to come out on top. And wouldn't England love to win this war and be able to take back over the land that they had lost those years ago? So President Madison and Congress declare war on Britain, which leads us to this very brief timeline of events. Again, I said very brief. So in June of 1812, Congress declares war on Britain. And in 1813, the U.S. Navy wins a battle on Lake Erie. And this is a big deal, like I said, because the U.S. Navy is significantly smaller and less equipped than the British Navy. So this is a big deal. And Lake Erie is one of the Great Lakes up by Michigan and Canada and that region of the United States. On October 5th of 1813, the British were defeated at the Battle of Thames. Again, another big deal because the British are still stronger. And Andrew Jackson is one of the American generals in this war, which leads to him ultimately becoming one of our presidents. And I should say one of the presidents who is probably one of the least liked presidents, honestly, in our country's history. He was not a very nice man, but he was a really good general. In August of 1814, the British, having had it with being defeated at some of these smaller battles, basically decide to march to Washington, D.C. and hit the United States where it's going to hurt the most. So they basically march to Washington, D.C. and set the city on fire, including the White House, which is why the White House that we have, let me go back here, set the White House on fire. The White House that we have today is not the original White House because the first one burned down in the War of 1812. So there are two people that we're going to talk about as the British set fire to Washington, D.C. Okay. One we've already talked about, but Dolly Madison we have not. Now, Dolly Madison is President Madison's wife. And as the White House is burning to the ground and everybody is fleeing and running, Dolly Madison is very well known because she has the foresight and the knowledge to realize, there's probably some really important things that I should take out of this White House that might be important to our country's future and our country's history. So she grabs some very important government documents, some papers, and most notably, this portrait right here of George Washington. This portrait still hangs in the White House today. So as chaos is ensuing and people are leaving, she grabs up all these things, gets some people to help her, and grabs this portrait of George Washington, recognizing the importance of it, that he was our country's first president. And thanks to her, we still have this portrait that hangs in the White House today. Now, the other cool person that we've kind of already touched on is Francis Scott Key. And we've already talked about him when we talked about the national anthem. He wrote the Star-Spangled Banner during battle while watching the fighting take place over Fort McHenry and witnessing the American flag still standing amidst all of the gunfire and destruction and fire and bombings. And it inspired him to write what has become our national anthem. Now, all of this is happening, and there's other battles. Obviously, the British win some, the Americans win some, and it ultimately leads to the British and Americans signing a peace treaty. It's called the Treaty of Ghent in Europe on December 24th, 1814, 2 years after the war started, right in time for Christmas. Isn't that nice? Now, the thing is one of the biggest battles that the Americans won actually took place after the peace treaty had been signed. Andrew Jackson went and won a big battle in New Orleans to maintain control of that port of New Orleans after this peace treaty had been signed, like 2 weeks after this had been signed. The problem is because word travels so slowly, he didn't know the war was actually over. So Andrew Jackson, who gets credit for winning this great battle in the War of 1812, technically took place after the War of 1812 had already ended. But nobody could just pick up the phone and say, hey, Andrew Jackson, the war is over, buddy. You can all go home. So Andrew Jackson gets credit with winning the one of the biggest battles that technically happened after the war. So the end result of all of this, the peace treaty being signed after the British decided to surrender, was that the Americans win again. They are victorious, and England has to go home with their tail between their legs because they lost to the United States for the second time. So America, back-to-back champions of wars with England in the late 1700s and early 1800s. So this part of the reason that the British lost also was because their resources were spread so thin. The British didn't have all of their focus on the United States in this war. They were also being pulled by this war, but also by the war with France. And so the Americans defeat the British again, and this is really kind of the last big war that we see the Americans and the British fighting against. After this, they kind of go their separate ways. England decides to focus more on areas in Europe and maintaining control of their land there, and the United States continues to focus on their land here in the United States. The US is not looking to get into wars. They just kind of happen to find themselves in these wars trying to defend their land. The next war that we will see the United States take place in, we will talk about on Thursday, and that has to do with the state that is now Texas. Okay, so in the end, the United States wins. They didn't gain a whole lot out of it, not that we're going to talk about anyway. They basically just got to keep their land, and the British just all left. So that is a very, very, very basic summary of the War of 1812. Now, before we go into your assignment, I have this very, very, very short video clip that kind of summarizes up what we talked about. Whoops, maybe. There we go.
In the early 1800s, Great Britain and France were at war. The United States was a young country with an economy that depended on trade with France. The British wanted to stop this trade. Great Britain used their ships to create blockades at many American ports. Because the British were at war with France, they needed many soldiers. Great Britain began a practice called impressment. When United States ships were stopped from sailing into France, any sailors on the American ships that had been born in Great Britain were impressed and forced to leave the American ships and fight in the war against France. On the western frontier of the United States, white settlers were being attacked by American Indians who felt the whites were stealing their land. The British decided to help the American Indians and gave them weapons to fight the white settlers. All of these things made the people of the United States angry. On June 18th of 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain. For almost 3 years, Great Britain and the United States fought many battles. The war began to affect the United States economy, and many Americans wanted the war to end. A meeting between leaders from the United States and Great Britain was held in Ghent, Russia. After months of discussion, both countries agreed to end the war. The War of 1812 showed the American people that their country had the power to fight back against Great Britain, which was a very powerful nation. The people of the United States became very proud of their country, and a great era of growth and an increase in patriotism began for the United States.
All right, so the United States winning this war just kind of reiterated the fact that, you know, they can still hang with the big boys, basically, especially now that they are more established and people really started to feel pride in their country. So for your work, you are going to be creating a mini newspaper article. You're going to create a short article and a headline about the War of 1812. Now, here's where you get a choice. Your newspaper article can either be from the point of view of the Americans winning or the British losing. So you can have some fun with this if you decide to, depending on which, for whichever viewpoint that you choose. So your a headline, your newspaper article should have a creative headline, and your article should be 7 to 10 detailed sentences covering the war, saying, you know, the Americans won. Yes. If your sentence is the Americans won, the British lost, that is not a detailed sentence. Detailed sentences mean that you are incorporating information specifically from the lesson into what you are writing. You can obviously be creative with it, but you do need to have actual facts from what we've talked about. Okay. Also, you are writing, so pay attention to correct spelling, grammar, punctuation, format, all of that. And you'll also need to include an image. So let me show you what it will look like. This is what your slide will look like. Okay, so up here where it says headline, you would double click. You can erase that and you would type in whatever your headline is. Your headline should obviously fit with whatever point of view you are taking. Okay, and here is where you would write your 7 to 10 detailed sentences. You would obviously highlight this and erase it before you start typing. If you need more space as you're typing, you can adjust and make this box go wider or longer, or you can adjust the font size too. Okay, and then here is where you would put your picture. Your picture, I put this box here, you can get rid of the box, but your picture should be about this size because this is about, I mean, if you look at it, this nicely fits up the empty space here. Okay, so this is what you are going to be doing. Be creative and have fun with it, but also be detailed and accurate. And you can go back in this video and pause on slides of different parts of information that you might need. All right, so that is your very, very brief and basic rundown of the War of 1812. Emmy and I are here to say goodbye, and we hope you have fun with this. We are almost done with our history, and then in the next few weeks, we're gonna try to do our big year-end review, although it might look a little different than how it normally does. Right? Can they do it? Can you say bye? Can we take this out? Can you say bye?
Bye.
Bye. Say have a fun day. You can blow him a kiss too. That's so nice.
Mama.
Good job. All right. Bye, guys.